Hi, this is JR. This is a video response to actually a written blog, something I saw posted on Facebook from a friend of mine, a Facebook friend of mine. And with regard to, making comments on Facebook and responding to comments on Facebook, we're probably interested in sharing ideas, sharing information, but in particular sharing perspectives and ideas. And um, when someone displays a perspective that is in many ways similar to our own, then we may be interested in saying, well, here's how that idea or that perspective is close to mine, and here's something a little distinct, or maybe even a lot distinct, but related to that original perspective. And when I say, perspective, when someone's posting something on Facebook, we presume they're interested in it. There's something interesting to them about it, or they wouldn't post it. And if I'm responding to something, then I must be interested in the content in some way, or I wouldn't be responding. So we have that basic kind of social dynamic of Facebook as a point of reference. I also want to very early on say language is always active when we're referencing Facebook exchanges or articles posted online. We often don't make reference to the fact that language is a major factor in how communication actually flows, or how that kind of communication flows as far as an online dialogue or exchange. So the original post made reference to court systems, governments, the term justice, and I'm going to use this stimulus of that article to just set up a sequence of probably pretty simple observations. Uh, a lot of how I would describe, how I would describe a lot of what I do in my Facebook presentations is to state the obvious, state things that are self-evident, but in sequences that are not familiar or not common to most people. So each point may be self-evident or obvious, but I'll string them together in a way that may be unfamiliar and intriguing and valuable and can bring clarity where there may be some degree of confusion or ignorance, but an interest in clarity or comprehension. So language is a basic foundation for communication, and we'll be attentive to language here. If you would join me in being attentive to language, I'm going to be attentive to how language works. What is it and how it works? And this will be pretty brief relative to some of my other presentations, but language is made up in many cases of claims. So like an assertion. On the 15th of October 2013, the following events happened. That's a claim or an assertion or a statement. In legal proceedings, we make reference to claims. We can also recognize a specific kind of construction language I'm going to call a denial, which would be on October 13, 2013, the following did not happen, or the one party in this case has stated that blah, blah, blah happened. In fact, what happened was blah, 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 blah. So that would be, if there's, you know, a countering of a claim, you could call that a counterclaim, but in legal context, the term counterclaim is pretty specific, but it is a contradiction, a speaking against, or a speaking that is contrary, a diction or dictation or assertion that's contrary to some other comment. So we've got claims, we've got denials. And all of these are on top of code. The whole construction of claims and denials and so forth are out of codes, out of language, which is a set of codes or a set of encoding. Codes are things that can have multiple meanings. So when I say arguments, I could say, well, there's arguments, but there's positive arguments, negative arguments, rational arguments, frivolous arguments. So I could have all these different categories of arguments, and that the point there is that the word arguments doesn't have one meaning. It is a classifier, and it can have subclassifiers connected to it, and it can be, you know, when I say the argument stated in paragraph 9 is false, well, then I'm using the phrase the argument in paragraph 9. It's like a code for a computer programmer. We know that means go pull the function from paragraph 9 of the argument. So we have to go to paragraph 9, know what the argument is from that, and then now we've got this variable. That's the argument from paragraph 9. And we use that in a function or in a command sequence when we're talking about computer programming. So I want to make these references to just set up this background point that language works a particular way. There are multiple meanings that go with codes. That's the nature of codes, is that they can have multiple meanings, or you could say multiple interpretations, but also with pronouns, she can refer to different people in different paragraphs or different chapters or different centuries or different books or whatever. The word she doesn't mean one particular person. It is a referent term. It refers to something else. That's how codes, that's how language works. Language is a type of coding. It's not a pictorial code, or we could say written text. That's a pictorial or graphic code. But language itself isn't a graphic code. You could say it's a neurological code, but it's definitely related to sound and symbolic sounds. But as far as the argument in paragraph 9, we can talk about argument in a couple different ways. Two contrary conceptual arguments can make one interpersonal argument, where two people, two agents, or two parties can present contrary conceptual arguments, and then they are arguing with each other. There's an argument between them. There's a controversy between them. So court systems involve controversy. They involve language, and they involve controversies in language. That's pretty much how court systems work, or that's pretty much what court systems are for, is to resolve controversies in language in certain ways. So there's like a ritual for resolving controversies in language. So different court systems have slightly or greatly different rituals. So now we'll get to a historical detail. This is a point of information that may be new to some people. Long before Moses and the Ten Commandments, there was a prophet named Noah, according to the traditional Hebrew histories and the Old Testament and so on. And Noah added a 7th commandment to the 6 that existed prior to Noah. The seventh commandment was to establish courts of justice. That's the way it's been translated into English in most versions that someone would find. The Noahide commandment. The seventh Noahide commandment is to establish courts of justice. The sixth prior commandments were actually from the time of Adam, and so they're not per se Noah's commandments. The commandments of Moses include the prior commandments of Adam, those six, and the commandments of Moses presume the existence of Noah's seventh commandment, but that's not actually listed amongst the 10 of Moses. But the seventh commandment, so that's all just historical background, the seventh commandment is, again, to establish courts of justice. And these aren't just courts of justice internal to the Hebrew tribes and the Hebrew nation. The odd thing about Noah's proclamation was that they were establishing courts of justice over all of humanity. That was the idea. So within the Hebrew tradition and the 6 commandments or 6 rules prior to Noah, which included things like do not commit murder within our tribe, do not murder your neighbor, do not murder your brethren, do not steal from your neighbor or your brethren, and so on. So those 6 prior commandments were internally enforced within the Hebrew community. Noah said, we are facing a second apocalypse. There was the flood in the time of Noah, and then, wiping out huge numbers of humans and other organisms. And Noah was saying we're subject to another and even more extreme apocalyptic destruction. And in order to please God or appease God and prevent God punishing us with a destruction, an apocalypse, we must obey certain guidelines. We need to organize ourselves and regulate ourselves and govern ourselves in a way that fits with God's commandments to us, or God's preferences, or something like that. Now, Noah was using the phrase, when I refer to Noah referencing God, Noah was using the term God in a particular way, and all this is being translated from ancient Hebrew into English. In my case, I'm speaking English, of course. So Noah was using a word God in a particular way, and according to tradition, and he was saying something really distinct from prior warlords or prophets of the Hebrew people, prior priests, whatever you might call it, kings. Noah was saying, according to tradition, we as the Hebrews, now we rule over all of humanity. So it's up to us to impose on the rest of humanity certain regulations. So we are authorized by God to regulate the rest of humanity, and if we fail, then humanity will be wiped out in another apocalypse. And if the rest of humanity fails to comply with our demands, then once again that God will punish them either by wiping out all of humanity or by punishing them in particular through our swords or some other way. And as time went on, after Noah came Moses, and Moses was much more militant according to the written records than Noah was, in terms of Noah ordering the slaughter of the Midianites and the other massacres and genocides and rapes and all the stuff that's reported in the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. So there's the setup in Exodus of Noah saying, here's the foundation of our conceptual model. Here's what we're, where we're, our story, and here's our context. And then Noah actually was much more involved in acts of organized violence, where he would send out armies and send out squads to kill. And, of course, collect the valuables and capture the virgin women for other uses, which are reasonably explicitly stated in the Old Testament. So anyway, so that's some of the background of Noah and how it kind of, eventually developed into Moses and other leaders over time. So Noah set up, we're going to regulate humanity. We're going to regulate them through courts of justice. And justice is whatever the ruling warlord or judge or the justice of the court, like the Supreme Court justice, whatever the official called the justice dictates and then successfully enforces through the coercion of the court system's armed mercenaries. That's what justice is. So whatever the warlord states and then actually enforces through the mechanisms of the court system's military capacity, that is justice. In fact, just the judge making a particular statement or declaration, it's called justice within that court system, and then again, if the mercenaries can't enforce that rule, then it's that's becomes the norm of justice. That becomes the accepted social expectation, the standard, the ritual. So what these courts of justice did that was new and distinct from prior Hebrew internal regulatory systems was to enforce rules over all of humanity. It was an imperialist or a colonial declaration. They were saying, we rule the world. Wherever you are, that's subject to our authority. We're the Hebrews, and we, with the Levi tribe and the other tribes, we're going to rule over the rest of humanity. And I mentioned the Levi in particular, the Levites, because that's the ruling class or ruling tribe within the Hebrew tradition, to the extent of the Levites being the priestly class or the priestly tribe. That tribe was the ruling priests, which would include the people who could form councils or who individually would hold court, say, I, as the fully robed and duly authorized official of the empire, I now make the following ruling in this case. We're going to write it down, we're going to sign it, we're going to distribute it, and this is what I'm going to authorize the mercenaries of the court system to enact or to enforce. So that's the commands, the commanding officers giving these commands to the military units. And these units, in many cases, are just like two soldiers. Like if we think in terms of modern court systems, a lot of times you'll see two armed men or women, two armed officers of the court will go out to enforce a warrant, or whatever the circumstance might be. A lot of times officers will go in pairs when they're doing certain levels of coercion. A normal officer may go out by themselves if they're just on a normal patrol, but if they're actually going out to do something, a lot of times they'll go with 2 or more officers at once. And of course, they have a whole group of other officers who are available in the event of need to call for backup. So Noah said, let's have these courts, our courts, rule over everybody. And gave a justification for that ruling, which was that God would destroy humanity if the Hebrews did not do that. If the Levites didn't do it, and the rest of the Hebrews didn't support the Levites in doing it, and the rest of humanity didn't support that system, God's going to, destroy us all. And in particular, God's going to punish individuals and groups who are, like the Midianites, who are tempting the men of the Hebrew tribes by virtue of their women being healthy and unprotected, not well defended. That temptation, or whatever the details were, that temptation, led to the sins of Israel or the Hebrew tribes in terms of them, those men, marrying the women of the Midianites or whatever else was going on. And instead of Moses, this is jumping from Noah back to Moses, or ahead to Moses, instead of Moses saying, oh, that's fine, Moses said, no, we can't have that. We've got to have, if we're going to have our men interacting with these Midianite women, we're going to do so as they're going to be our slaves. They're going to be sex slaves or child brides and so on. They're not going to have an equal status within the Hebrew community as the Hebrew women. That's, not part of the system present at the time of Moses. So they had a much reduced social status for those Midianite women, and just killed all the other Midianites, the boys, the females that had children, they were killed, the elders, the men, all of the males. And so the tribes, this is Numbers 29, Numbers 31, look in verses, look in those chapters for some of the details of what I'm referring here. I think those are the right chapters, if you care. So the idea is that we have different groupings of people. There are the privileged people like the Levites or the high priest or the Messiah or the Mashiach, or the Hebrew word, more or less, I'm not pronouncing it very well, but the king of kings, and then the various kings below the king of kings, or the emperor, right? The high prophet, the high priest, and then there's the other priests or the other officers, the captains and the majors and the lieutenants and the sergeants and so on. But all of those lower ranking officers, those are subordinate to the top of the chain of command. And the idea, of course, is that God is at the top of the chain of command, and Moses is the person that speaks for God to the Hebrews, and then the Hebrews, enforce that on the rest of humanity by violence, by coercion. So back to the basic nature of governments, they regulate. So what do governments regulate? What does it mean for governments to regulate? They do regulate the use of language, which I'll come back to more in a moment, but they also regulate all types of human behavior, really. Murder, for sure, or killing, intentional killing of another human. Definitely they regulate that. They authorize it and license it in particular cases. They write it up and say, we declare war on that tribe, or we authorize that the CIA shoot to kill that suspect. Whatever the case may be, these imperialist court systems authorize violence, license violence, as well as criminalize any acts of murder or violence that aren't part of the system. So they regulate or ritualize human sacrifice. They regulate or ritualize extortion, which we'll get back to in a bit. They regulate and ritualize fraud, coercion, deception, etc. So this is a point that many people may overlook. They may think of governments as being opposed to fraud. And that's an interesting idea, interesting enough to make a little side tangent comment about it. Governments and imperialist operations, like the Hebrew tribes and so on, they may use language in ways that set up ideals in their target populations, the governed. They want to promote consent or promote compliance. They can set up ideals like Santa Claus. If you demonstrate good behavior, then you're going to get better rewards. Ideas like heaven and hell. If you don't comply with us, we're going to torture and kill you according to the standards of the Holy Roman Empire, and then you're going to go to hell where you'll face eternal punishments. However, if you comply with us, then you're going to go to heaven and you'll be rewarded with, after you die, you'll be given exclusive access to dozens of horny virgins. That's a typical kind of promised reward with the promised land of, the afterlife, the utopia, heaven, paradise. That's the idea that is presented, that kind of idea. The particular detail I just stated is more familiar within Islamic branch of the Abrahamic traditions, but you've got amongst the Hebrew prophets, you've had Abraham, Noah, Moses, and so on. There's three main branches of the Hebrew tradition: the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. Those are all branches from those same Middle Eastern sources. And we could talk about, the predecessors to, where did the, from what other cultures did the Hebrews borrow their systems? But I'm going to ignore that issue for the moment and say, let's just go with the idea that the Hebrews originated all of this. Not that I am asserting that, but that it simplifies the conversation by, saying, well, let's just start as if that were true. So I mentioned regulating language. So telling people, training people what should be, that's idealism. That's promoting idealism. Especially if it's done in a very undisciplined way. So it's not what should be relative to a context, a specific context, but just what should be in general. So, for example, if I say within the rituals of the empire of coercion called the Holy Roman Empire, if you know that today is a Friday, you should be eating fish for dinner. So that's distinct from saying it's Friday, you should be eating fish, without specifying the context. But it's not a big, it's not that surprising that there would be cases where people don't specify the context. Maybe they don't even know the context. They just take the shortened version of it, the simple version of it, and say, hey, the warlord said blah, 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 or the high priest told us over and over that if we do blah, 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 then we get to go to heaven. And I want to go to heaven, so it's Friday, therefore we should eat fish, or whatever the expectation or the ideal is. So once the desired outcome is identified, that can be related to from idealism that it's absolutely always true across all cultures, across all times, across all conditions and circumstances. Or we can say that's an ideal within a context. So one of the idealisms. This is what a government should do and how government should operate. They shouldn't use fraud, which is, an amazing idea. If one actually studies the history of governments, the idea that government shouldn't use fraud is hilarious. So I've made the reference lately that there's hilarious and hysterical are two of the major choices that we have. People who operate from idealism based on panic and fear, social anxiety, they're hysterical. The other way to look at it is it's hilarious. The idea that everyone on the planet, no matter what, should eat fish on Friday. What? What if you don't live near any bodies of water, a river, an ocean, a bay, a lake? What if you don't live near any of those things? What if you're 2 years old, or I don't know. What if you have a certain, what if, I don't know what. The point is, why is it absolutely, oh, it's Friday, you should blah, blah, blah. And how do you tell if it's Friday or not? Is it when the sun sets or when the sun rises or midnight? What's the beginning of Friday? And what's the end of Friday? And, all of these issues that are cultural. They're rituals. There's nothing wrong with them being, ritual kind of standards. We just have this invented standard that we're going to start Friday at midnight when it gets to be 12 or after midnight. So at 12 midnight, it's still Thursday. But at 12:01, now it's Friday. We just make up some 24-hour, cycle, and we just make all this stuff up. But as a cultural or religious ritual, they're perfectly valid. There's no reason that it shouldn't be 24 hours in a day. 24 is a perfectly reasonable number of hours to have. 25 or 20 or 100 or whatever would also be understandable, convenient divisions of time, but it's 24. That's what we use. That's what I've been accustomed to using. I'm confident that there are cultures within the planet who speak about time with some other system, fractions of a day or whatever periods are important to them. So regulating language, though, to standardize what everybody's doing. What year how do we count the year? How do we count the day? How do we count the month? How do we count the hour, and so on, the time of day? All of these things are they're just standards. They're just rituals. And it's not that eating fish on Friday is itself going to prevent an apocalypse from God destroying humanity or destroying the earth. It doesn't mean that if you eat fish on Friday every day of your life, you will go to heaven when you die. I understand that people might promote that idea, that Santa's going to give you better gifts if you only would eat fish on Friday. I understand why those kinds of assertions would be made, why those kinds of statements would be made to influence the behavior of people, but it just doesn't seem very logical. It might be that it's good to eat fish occasionally because seafood's healthy or something like that, and we also know that we don't want to, overburden desert tribes and nomadic tribes with, eating fish 5 days a week or 7 days a week. They just don't have that much access to fish. So how about at least once a week, or whatever the logic is. And so they set up rituals, they set up standards. There's nothing wrong with kosher or all the variations of kosher, because, in case you didn't know, there are different versions of kosher. There are different authorities or congregations that use different standards for what they qualify as kosher. And unless their high standard, or unless their group standards have been certified by an official of that tradition, by a rabbi, then that food isn't kosher. It's basically food is not kosher until it's been ritually assessed and acknowledged, recognized, labeled as kosher. So we could say Jews should eat kosher foods, but then that just raises the question, well, what is kosher food? So different Hebrew tribes are different. There's the same kind of rule in Islam. There's not much attention to dietary restrictions in most of Christianity, but within Islam and within Judaism, some groups, many groups, are restrictive in regard to diet. And they like to have things approved by a priest or an official whose job is to make sure that certain regulations are followed by butchers and by farmers and so on. They want to certify that this is approved by the ritual authority, by the ritual officer, or the officer that's officiating over that community, or regulating the practices of that community. So I've covered a lot of really the issues that are brought up in the article. It was an article related to health and certain statements made about health, probably, like doing a particular thing, using a particular product or substance is going to produce the following favorable results. Like there's probably a statement like that made by someone in relation to a particular legal controversy. And there's the issue of the story of disease. We are trained in how to think of governments, how to think of other people, how to think of language. We're also trained to think in particular ways about disease. So if someone goes to an institution where that institution is repeating a slogan or a concept over and over and over and then saying, we're going to test you on whether you can repeat that slogan back to us, that's called, one institution that fits what I just said would be a public school. So public school isn't targeting comprehension. They're targeting memorization and compliance. So you memorize the concept and then you repeat it back on the test, and if the concept is inaccurate scientifically, that's not an issue really. The issue is, did the student learn it and repeat it in conformity to the answer key on the test? So developed out of boot camps for military officers or military soldiers, developed out of the training systems for police officers, the training systems for priests and nuns and all of that kind of thing. Public schools come from that same tradition. It's not about comprehension. It's about discipline within the classroom first and foremost. And secondly then, repetition of ideas. Memorization, repetition, memorization, repetition, memorization, repetition. And as time goes on, comprehension can be a target of a public school curriculum. But the whole idea of a curriculum is a central authority is going to tell the various lower ranking officers and bureaucrats and ministers and low ranking priests, here's what you will be programming the students with. Here's the content to put into their attention and to reward them for learning, memorizing, repeating, and so on. So in regard to disease, a popular idea within many institutions at this time, 2014, is that genetic predispositions to disease are important. It's somewhat of a new idea in the sense of it's not 500 years old or 5,000 years old that I'm aware of. There are ways to identify genetic sequences now within a person, just as you can look at their fingerprint or take a blood test and look at the genetic code in their blood or in a skin cell sample, or a hair sample, we can identify a huge, not just individual people, but identify a lot of information about them and about their background. We can tell if they're male or female just from a blood sample, for instance, or just from a snippet of hair. Isn't that interesting that, you know, hair would contain an identifier if it came from a male or a female? You can tell if it came from was it the hair from a human, or the hair from a chimp, or the hair from a canine, or the hair from a hairy tarantula. You can simply look at the DNA or the genetic code of within the hair and tell where it came from. Tell the gender of the spider or the dog. You know, there's all sorts of data that's encoded. Now, within codes can be used in different ways. Remember what codes are. So that same code can be expressed in a variety of ways. So the same code can be triggered in different ways. So how that code is written is like one variable. And then how that code is utilized is a second variable. So what we eat, what environmentally is in our midst in terms of electromagnetic fields and forces, and are we subject to radiation? Are we subject to lightning strikes? Are we, you know, what's in the diet? Are there GMO modified grains with lots of pesticides and Roundup chemicals? And how hydrated is the interior of a cell? And how much fat is in the diet? And what kind of fat is it? Is it polyunsaturated fatty acids from highly processed rancid corn oils? Or is it raw, saturated omega-3 rich fat from a Arctic salmon fish, or cod, the liver of a cod fish? You know, so there's all sorts of varieties of factors. So we take that original genetic code and then all these other factors, and the combination of the two things produces results or effects, and we can call that epigenetics. So it's the awareness of genetics as important, like it matters whether a creature, an organism, is a male or a female in their original genetics. That does make a difference. And then all of the things that influence how the genetic predispositions manifest. So in our modern focus on illness, as of today in the mainstream, there's some focus on genetic predispositions and rather little focus on how different environmental or behavioral factors will influence those genetic predispositions. And one of the issues that I've seen come up, someone was commenting on Huntington's disease, and they were talking about what appeared to me to be a progressive deterioration of the genetic code of an organism, in the sense of, over time, the quality or precision of the replication of the genetic code from one cell to the next generation of cell, that quality or precision of the replication can drop significantly due to certain factors, certain, you know, restrictions on health. And when the replication or process, the copying process, is really inefficient or really imprecise, then you have what you would call a high rate of mutation. So it's not the genetic code that someone was born with, it's actually different code. And as their life goes on, and if their precision of their replication process is notably low, then they're going to have a lot of mutation, and later in their life they're going to have, you might even say, like a genetic chaos. There's going to have a lot of different things in a lot of different places and parts of their body, and the cells that are 2 years old and 2 months old and 2 days old are all going to be working based on a different program, that is also a possible issue. So the basic idea about the story of health would be genetics predispose us to certain unfavorable things, and then if you have that predisposition, you're, too bad. There's not much that can be done about it. That's one perspective on health. That's a understandable perspective. Another perspective is there are genetic predispositions, and then there are environmental and behavioral factors that take from the potentials and capacities of those genetic programs and trigger certain programs. And trigger certain programs very well. Respiration, ovulation, the beating of the heart, everything we can think of as a program. There's a sequence of events, in many cases a cycle, and sleeping is an important program. And for a creature whose sleep program isn't working well, there are a lot of other repercussions for other programs. So you have a complex system in a living organism where you have a lot of different things: respiration, sleep, hydration, circulation of blood, circulation of lymph, white blood cells. There's all these different issues, and if all of them are working well, you get one kind of result, and if one or two of them are working poorly, eventually that can lead to other systems working poorly just because one is not working well. So once you stop having one thing work well, that'll have effects on everything else, basically. So that's a holistic model as opposed to a reductionist model, which is looking almost exclusively or even totally exclusively at something like genetic code, or we're just going to look at an X-ray and that's all we're going to look at. Like, we're not going to look at your skin, we're just going to look at an X-ray. Or we're just going to look at your skin and we're not going to look at an X-ray. Or we're just going to look at an X-ray but we're not going to look at your genetic code. Like, those reductionist or compartmentalized perspectives are common within mainstream medicine. They're just not very effective. They might be quite lucrative though, which some people would assert the whole point of the healthcare industry is to profit, to make money. So promoting health is a totally distinct issue from promoting profit. So we've covered a pretty wide range of things here, but there are assertions made in language, and courts regulate controversies in language, controversies of contradicting claims, contradicting assertions, contradicting stories. Courts, through violence and also their ritual procedures, will, in the case of the Ferguson, Missouri shooting of a civilian by a privileged status law enforcement mercenary officer, soldier, whatever, the prosecutor of that case allegedly was very unusually soft on the cop, which is to say the prosecutor was really soft on their colleague, because the prosecutor and the cop are part of the same team, you might say. The prosecutor was really soft on their own colleague, and thus the ritual procedure of how to produce a criminal trial, they started it, but the prosecutor did such a minimal job that the grand jury did not return an indictment or a approval to proceed further with the criminal trial or criminal procedure. So in the case of Caspar Weinberger, the high-ranking U.S. official a few decades ago, he was indicted but was not tried because the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, or Bush Sr., intervened and said, I'm pardoning Weinberger. We haven't actually convicted him yet, but I'm going to go ahead and pardon him just in case he's a criminal. I'm going to just halt the proceeding. And that's entirely normal. That's something done by every president in the history of the United States, except for like one president who died 16 days after getting into office from getting killed by an assassin, or I forget why, but basically all the presidents, they pick certain, usually people who are convicted criminals, and pardon them. In the case of Caspar Weinberger, he was pardoned just after being indicted. But in the case of, I believe, I don't remember the name of the officer off the top of my head, but in the case of the Ferguson, Missouri shooting of the civilian by the cop, the prosecutor, you could say, botched the prosecution. In other cases, the prosecutors would never proceed. They just would, take the paperwork and lose it, or choose not to proceed. We don't have enough evidence, or whatever it is. That prosecutor attempted to get an indictment, but what I've read of other lawyers commenting on the issue and other prosecutors commenting on the issue is that that prosecutor was attempting to not get an indictment. They were attempting to produce the result of no indictment in order to protect the interests of their colleague, we would presume, the officer that was accused, the suspect. Or I guess everybody knows he killed. There's no controversy over whether the officer killed the civilian. It's just should it be prosecuted as a criminal charge. So the rituals of the various priests, the prosecutors, the judge, the officers, all the different levels of the priesthood, they did their jobs. They killed this person and they protected that person and they did all the things they did. And the court went through its rituals and the outcome was no indictment. In that particular case, in the case of Caspar Weinberger, the court ritual produced indictment, and then the president intervened and said, I've got higher ritual authority over that grand jury, so we're going to stop the wheels of justice. And what does justice mean? It means the court system. Whatever the court system with its military power declares or dictates. So the military power is first, and then the statements in language. When they write the ink on the paper, it matters because that is a oath-sworn priest within the judicial system. The judge says, I authorize a $10,000 reward for anybody who can bring me the head of a native of the following tribe. If you can bring me the head or the scalp of blah, 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 or bring, dead or alive, you bring me that suspect, then we're going to give you $100,000 or $10,000 or 5,000 bushels of grain, corn, whatever it is. They set up the price on the head, or the price on the execution, the decapitation of their target. So they authorize assassinations. They authorize killing. There's the public authorizations that happen within the court system, and then the secret authorizations that happen within the military and the secret services, the secret societies, the CIA, the NSA, the Mossad, things like Al-Qaeda, and so on. The Levites don't necessarily announce to all the Hebrews what the Levites are planning to do as far as their assassinations. The CIA doesn't necessarily publicize it on mainstream news. We're planning to kill the following political leaders within the U.S. and outside the U.S. in the next couple of years. They don't necessarily announce that. In fact, they don't typically announce that. They, in fact, will have diversions and distractions and cover stories to deny their involvement in many cases. So that's just some details of how human society has been working for quite a while. And court systems have been around for thousands of years and seem to be reasonably stable. Their military superiority over the majority of civilians seems pretty stable and steady and secure. And how we relate to court systems could be a subject of some interest at some point in the lives of various people, maybe you. How we relate to language and how we use language, I think, would be of interest to most anyone. In a court system or in an indoctrination program such as a Sunday school or a public school or a university, we might learn that language isn't that important. Language is only 7% of communication, or something. You might learn some little trivial, mathematical reference like that. It could be that in some cases, language is quite important. And in other cases, it's not at all important. So when is language important and how is it important? That could be of interest. When are governments important and how are they important? That could be of interest. Might be. As a final note, when governments say we're going to create an extortion system and the masses need to give us economic support, the court system can invent these liabilities or debts of the public. We'll call them taxes, and we'll say that the taxes need to be paid in the following way: on a certain date, to a certain address, and in a certain currency or in a certain method of payment. It must be a money order, or it must be in US dollars. What's a US dollar? Well, we'll tell you about that. Come down to the court and we'll sell you some US dollars. You just bring us your gold or your silver or your pesos or your euros or your Swiss francs, and you bring some of that down to the court or to the bank. Next door to the court, there's a bank for foreign exchange, and we'll get you sorted out. We'll let you know what you owe us and what currency is best for you to pay us in. And by setting up those systems of collection, inventing liabilities, and threatening punishments like decapitation or confiscation of property for people who don't conform to the extortion racket or the taxation system, court systems create demand for currencies. In the absence of a court system, the little pieces of paper with the ink that we know as currencies, they have no exchange value as coupons. They're only coupons that are good within the jurisdiction of that court system. Within the jurisdiction of that court system, those coupons can be redeemed. You can use them to discharge tax liabilities, for instance. So court systems invent tax liabilities, and they also say we're going to regulate extortion here because we don't want unauthorized competition. If other organizations want to create, if other operations of extortion are in our midst, in our regional jurisdiction, they must conform to our guidelines, or else we're going to call them criminal, and we're going to penalize them. Of course, we reserve the right to botch indictments and to overturn, convictions and pardon criminals, but we regulate crime. We regulate human social activity. We regulate human behavior. We regulate humanity because we are we're the saviors of humanity. We're saving humanity from a divine apocalypse, from a threatening God. And that is the basic idea of courts and governments. That's the story of courts and governments. We save humanity from extinction and disorder and so on by regulating crime, by regulating language, by regulating human behavior. So for some people, the self-evident and obvious things that I just strung together in that particular sequence could be somewhat relieving, relaxing to just go, oh, that's all. So instead of being caught up in that sense of I need to save humanity from the court systems, and I need to save humanity from unjust governments, and I need to save humanity from ritual human sacrifice systems and extortion systems and fraud and all that. Well, what if the idea that all these civilians and citizens need to save humanity from fraud, what if that's part of the propaganda of these religious holy empires and their various regional governments? The King of Kings and their various local kings want all of their subjects to save humanity from operations of organized coercion, to deny the existence of operations of organized coercion. At least our system of organized coercion is not a system of organized coercion, because there should be no systems of organized coercion, because when I was first becoming an officer in our system of organized coercion, I was trained that systems of organized coercion are inherently wrong and forbidden, and that reverse psychology does not exist, and therefore, because it's forbidden for me to say that our system is a system of organized coercion, I'm going to say other stuff. And like they asked me on the test, is your system of organized coercion a system of organized coercion? I say no. Why? Because I advance up the ranks to get to a PhD in conformity or whatever, maybe microbiology or history of law and legal systems or whatever it is. So be attentive to language, or be vulnerable to being confused about how other people are using language, because you know what? If you're not attentive to how language can be important, then people who know how to use language well may be able to influence you through language. And if you know how to use language well, then you may at least be less vulnerable to being misled. You might even be able to use language to your advantage, whether in a court setting or any other setting. So it's possible that language could be useful to you at some point in the future. And if you are attentive to how various people use language and the various results that they get, then you could learn something. You could start to get curious and start to learn effective methods for the use of language in regard to producing particular results that you may value. Thanks for your attention. If you found this video interesting, you are welcome to comment, to share it, and so on.